Hello everyone, today we talk about Amalric of Bena, also known as Amaury de Bène, or Amaury de Chartres, in Latin Amalricus or Amalricus, or Amalricians, etc. He was born in fact in Bène, so this village close to Chartres. He died in Paris at the beginning of the 13th century. We don't know exactly when, either between 1204, 1207, probably 1206 actually, but I don't think we are sure. And he was a French philosopher and theologian. He taught in Paris logics and the liberal arts, and afterwards also theology as well. So he was accused of heresy in 1204, and he actually appealed to Innocent III, who confirmed his condemnation. And as we will see, Amalric was obliged to retract eventually, and to therefore admit his own errors. Although he is, as we will see, the tradition of his teaching lived on. Now, so I'm beginning to address these figures in of especially the 12th and 13th century, and here these heretical movements, etc. We will definitely have to talk in detail about also Joachim of Fiore and Arnaldo from Brescia and others. So as you understand, these are kind of introductory videos to look at, well, not just introductory, but just to look at the phenomenon as a whole. And really stressing, because people sometimes read the this is kind of weird. They read the name of these figures, and they say, "Oh well, this was just kind of an heretic of the Middle Ages," and they either, depending on what their inclination is from a terms of belief, they say, "Okay, well, it was an heretic," or otherwise it was a free thinker. There were no things like free thinkers at this time. I mean, I'm not saying it in negative way. I mean, it was really like the thought was orientated in extremely different ways. Eventually, the Enlightenment transformed these figures into kind of heroes of reason and such. But these people were not absolutely anything like that. These were fully Christian people who were substantially looking beyond what the official version of the Roman Church was, and in this they were stimulated by the fact that in Europe at this time, and I also talked about this so recently, there was the influence. It was starting to pour in lots of new works from worlds that were mostly non-Christian. Not only, by the way, because there were still certain Byzantine, works from the Middle Ages, but most of these were things like Aristotle, like other thinkers of the classical past, and mediated, by the way, through the Arab culture, the Jewish culture. So and with many other influences, telling the truth. So at this time, the Europeans were saying, "Wow, there is so much more to know." And since they were, however, fully Christian, because here we're not talking about, in the case of Amalric of Bena especially, we're not talking about strictly a pauperistic movement. This guy was a scholar. So, and he was teaching at the Studium of Paris, by the way. So this is something really. He was not a common individual. Indeed, he was an extremely cultured person. But what is important here is to frame these figures in their context, which is rarely done, hardly done, especially when they're presented to the great public. Let's say, as just think of the story of this individual as the individual, but it's not really about the individual. It's about the thought and understanding why that thought developed at that time. So you can actually make all these figures fit into this broader dialectic that existed within the same ecclesiastical institutions, because the ecclesiastical institutions in this time, the Gregorian reforms had already taken place, so the Church of Rome was already, especially at this period, at the peak of its power. But definitely there were lots of others, especially spontaneous organizations in terms of religious movements, and the commitment of Rome to protect it or repress these movements. And it was really a big thing, because especially during the 12th century, but still in the 13th by a certain degree, this heretical phenomenon was something structurally and massively spread. It wasn't something that was happening, because every once in a while there was someone who popped out and saying something slightly different from what the church said. Objectively, these thoughts were actually pretty. First of all, we have actually a problem to even describe them. Sometimes because we don't have many sources about them. This is the case also with Amalric of Bena. We don't have the first-hand informations about what he actually taught. We can basically guess, we can figure it out by a certain extent, but unfortunately we do not know. And this naturally was done because the church didn't want these thoughts to spread, but you can argue that in part, it was also it's also a problem of sources, because don't think in here that at the beginning of the 13th century we know this excessive much. Western Europe is speeding up, is really rocketing by especially those times standards of growth, but still it's a relatively there weren't so many sources at this time. It was relatively, I can't say primitive world because it sounds bad, but everybody who has looked at the sources of that period knows how difficult it is to look through well to those. In the following centuries, we have on the contrary, the problem that we start having too much. The 13th century is a bit this optimal medium, we can say. But especially relative to these thinkers that were eventually obliged either to retract or they were repressed, we know a very few. So, as we said, Amalric was a cultured man. He was a man of school. He taught in these extremely prestigious seats like Paris, and he was definitely influenced by his milieu. The idea is, well, let's go by order in here, that as we're saying, no writing, no source of his has no writing of his has survived, and we know we have just indirect news about his thoughts, and sometimes they are even distorted, they're twisted in a way we can't really understand whether they're just propaganda or is what his thinking was really about. And there is a debate, therefore, about what his thinking had developed from, and why in that way. He is believed to have been strongly influenced by John Scotus Eriugena, was this a very famous Irish theologian and Neoplatonist philosopher and poet. He had lived in the 9th century, and he was famously working within a very international milieu, we can say. He basically he transferred himself to France at the Palatine School of Charles de Bald, and he is mostly famous also for translations. He translated and made commentaries upon the work of the pseudo Dionysius, that was to become an extremely important work in Western European philosophy. He was actually one of the few works that at the time were translated from the Greek, because John was one of the few Westerners at the time that knew Greek and could translate it. He had been in Athens to study. He was extremely famous by certainly fascinating figure. And so his ideas were Amalric's ideas were also strongly influenced by the natural philosophy of Aristotle as well, and especially by the relative Arab commentaries that existed about at the time, and especially and the fact that he was teaching in Paris was not something surprising, as Aristotle was having a huge influence in Paris, and this was a very upsetting thing for the local authorities, because basically everyone was reading Aristotle, all of the scholars, of the students, and these texts the Church of Rome had not taken yet an official stand, but it's obvious that most of them were considered to be highly heterodox, if not, in fact, completely unattached from any Christian thinking, because the main problem at the time was obviously saying, okay, let's look at these works, even if they were written in times and by authors that were no Christian, but let's try to see if we can save something from that. And that today that eventually the Aristotelic system was integrated into the Christian thought in the West during the 13th century, but this occurred because it was spreading really pretty fast, and a solution had to be found, because it was impossible at that point to stop people, to prevent people at least from reading all these sources. And this, by the way, tells you how really when we think at repression in these contexts, we don't really have to think as if people couldn't do anything else. It was forbidden to read certain books and all, because this would happen anyway. The problem was really about teaching and the formation, in this sense, the education, the training of the new scholars. This time also were mostly, especially in France, were mostly religious thinkers, and had to cover very important. Usually their career entailed naturally an ecclesiastical career, and these bishops were extremely powerful people who eventually had to also deal with political problems, etc. So the spreading of these thoughts had to be necessarily stemmed in a way or in another. And Amalric of Bena is kind of one of the examples of how such new thinking was to produce slightly different to bring on the path of heterodoxy at best. So what happened is he was Amalric, as we've said, was really had already been condemned. So he was eventually forgiven because he retracted. However, so this was a scandal, naturally, but he basically, when he died, everything seemingly was settled at that point. However, after a few years, in 1210, there were essentially 14 clergymen that were inquired by the ecclesiastical authorities for the spread of heterodox doctrines, and it was found out that these had already all been pupils of Amalric. So this was naturally a very interesting indicator. We can put it in this way, and therefore from that time on, Amalric followers began to be called as Amalricians. So stressing the fact that Amalric's legacy had, in terms of heterodox thinking and teaching, had lived on through these followers. And the thing got pretty serious because actually 9 of these clergymen were burned. So they were condemned to death, and 3 were basically enclosed, imprisoned for life, and only 1 of them retracted. This is interesting because when you read these stories, you say, but these people could retract. Really, they could. There was a way out of that. Surely, their life probably afterwards would have not been extremely easy, but at least they could have remained alive, and just by saying, okay, I was wrong, I committed a mistake. And yet these people didn't. So this is, whatever way of whatever are your beliefs, I think it's, humanly speaking, it's very kind of moving and fascinating that such individuals who said, okay, no, I prefer to die rather than retracting, rather than going against something which I don't believe in. This is very important because, as we were saying before, these were Christian thinkers. I mean, that most of the heretics that existed out there at the time, really, they were surely aware of what of how their thinking differed from the one who was the official position of the church. And these people knew that, especially in this milieu, because they were very well-educated people. But at the same time, they largely still considered themselves perfect Christians, or better, even better Christians than the others. So there wasn't really this idea of challenging the whole system as such, but mostly to reform it, to get to a closer, to transform it, obviously, with the aim of perfecting the church and Christian lifestyle, either way or in another, and yet they and they truly felt this as an ethical duty, because they truly were concerned about their God, about the truth, about what they felt it was the right thing to do. So this has to be understood. And Christianism contains in itself the seeds of also martyrdom as such. I mean, even this idea of getting yourself killed through this process is something from them was probably seen with the hope of having a martyr's to become a martyr. So to witness even the sufferings of Christ and having his presence close to them. So with the hope to be remembered in a certain sense as those who had said it right, just like Christ from the Christian perspective had done, compared to the rest of the Jewish society. So these stands are important, and the more they were so big stands, I mean such determined stands, the more obviously the church was concerned about it, because eventually even the followers of these people would could say, oh my God, but these guys have really been, they could really think of them as martyrs eventually. And this happened actually with almost, you can arguably, anyone who was eventually burned at a stake or repressed in other violent measures. And what I find especially fascinating of this specific context is that, differently from, we've been talking about a lot about the pauperistic evangelical movements, and I tried to stress how these movements were mostly backed by political, social, economical problems fundamentally, and where the religious perspective was, I can't say an excuse, but it was really instrumental to push for other instances. That we don't have to stress maybe this excessively much, because I'm sure it was surely, these movements were surely felt really from a Christian point of view, but they were sometimes, these movements spread among people who really didn't know much about religion themselves, who just followed these figures, these preachers, because maybe they felt them to be holy, to be interpreting the true message of the gospel, which also in here we don't really know how really heterodox it was, because maybe it was just attacking the ecclesiastical institutions, but really was not so subversive from an ideological point of view. The case of Amalric is more, it's slightly different, because it basically originated into let's say into an elite, an elite of thinkers that were also not thinkers just like something else, but were essentially teaching and learning in the center of Western European, in the greatest theological center of Western Europe. So it was something dramatically concerned. By the way, the University of Paris at this time was over-expanding. There were lots of people, and these were mostly clergymen, however, because differently from other areas like Italy, where it was mostly laymen who wanted to learn law, because that was the specialization, especially of the studium of Bologna, etc. In Paris was really the theological center, so everybody who wanted to undertake the ecclesiastical career went there, and we are told it was full of clergymen there. Some of which, by the way, were young people, were going there, I don't know, from other countries, other places in Europe, and the sources also stressed that they weren't maybe so excessively devoted as they wished to be, as Paris was seen also this, already at the time, as this the city of love, of carnal, of sensuality, etc. So this was felt as also as a threat for the purity of these individuals. It was a problem that initially, especially there were lots of monks at this time, especially if you think about the Franciscans and the Dominicans. At a certain point, with the Dominicans it was a bit more immediate, with the Franciscans came later, but one of the main problems was that in order to fight the heresies, these monks had to be educated. So even if the monastic ideal was pretty different, so that the mendicant orders were quite mundane by the monastic standards of the 13th century, because they dwelled in the cities. They went exactly in where the heresies were spreading to try to counter them, and being themselves quite borderline, especially the Franciscans and their spiritual current. But these people were still relatively distrustful towards this great and suspicious and very cautious towards these centers of knowledge and of culture. So because they thought they could be deviated. And indeed, Paris was the place that arguably was experiencing the rise of some of the most unorthodox thinking in Europe. And this was all extremely dramatic, as as we were saying before. This had a fallout on this on the studium of theology, so that these doctrines could really confer a sort of genetical vice to the within the education of the future clergy of Europe. And so you understand why it was such a serious matter, and why people went so why even the condemnation, I mean the punishment of the Amalricians was so harsh. Because if someone at the outskirts of Christianity had heterodox thinking, and he was just, I don't know, living without preaching and without having, nobody cared. There was no way to control that. There was no way for the authority to even verify that, or at least, of course, the clergy, the priests. I mean, had also this task at a local level to check the commitment of the faithful, their education, their beliefs. But we all know that the largest part of the population at this point was Christian, but really didn't understand a big much about it. They could definitely feel much, but in terms of sheer theological orthodoxy, these people, I mean, let's be honest, they didn't even know how to read. So this, from one side, naturally prevented them from preaching in a certain measure, because even for preaching you need, well, of course, you can be indoctrinated by someone else that maybe told you those things by voice. So this is also another very interesting side of the story that we don't really know a big deal of. Mostly we rely on written accounts, but we don't know in daily life, for instance, how these doctrines were spread vocally. And the medieval world was a very vocal world, as you can imagine. So the voice, at least for them, had probably more importance than we give. I mean, we reason mostly. One thing has to be written to be true in some way, or to be usable, but with some degree of effect. The Middle Ages were a moment in which, and obviously also the written word was extremely important. Arguably, by certain standards, it was also more important than ours. But at the same time, the spoken word was also it had a very high specific weight. Even those written, I don't know, think of all these councils, even in the church, etc. Now we have the written accounts, but a big deal of that was also about proclamations. People talking, speaking, and with witnesses, and that was seen as largely also as an official way to sanction something, to affirm that, and to let other people that this had been told in that place, in that context. So a relatively different world from our own. But as I was saying, Amalric is all the more fascinating because this was his own was seemingly a much more elaborated thought that started from deeper intellectual premises, and that was therefore all the more dangerous, let's say, for orthodoxy at least. So there are these pretty harsh actions were carried out against Amalric posthumously, because Amalric basically Amalric rests after the condemnation of his followers, were were practically exhumed and scattered into the consecrated land. So just think about how, it's not surely a nice thing, and this posthumous measure was definitely, however, a great indicator of how deep, however, also the example of this master had been for his followers, so that he had retracted, but evidently he had not, probably, we don't really know actually, but his followers at least didn't want to give up, and were starting still to look at this figure not just as a master, as a teacher, but it's something more, as a master in a broader way, also as a spiritual guide, as a who knows, many of these heretical movements put an emphasis on the holiness of their preachers, of their leaders. Excuse me, I drink a little. So just imagine, even the also in a world like the medieval one, how important it was for a person who maybe came from, to learn. This is another perspective about the whole thing that fascinates me, because I always try to think at the psychology beyond these things. Like, these clergymen, the church at this time was relatively had a relative social mobility, we can say. If you were someone who maybe didn't come from a noble family, but had the opportunity to study, to be literate, etc., and you could go studying in Paris. You could come literally from nowhere by certain standards. This had always been so in the church, practically. Naturally, the higher echelons of the ecclesiastical hierarchy were usually reserved for extremely, usually for son of noblemen, people who naturally had a certain social status, etc. But this was not always true. You can see that also in the papacy. There were certain popes that also came from relatively humble origins, or were monks, etc. So a big deal of this success in the ecclesiastical career was also given to the ability of teaching, and how a person could become famous in terms of how many people followed this person. It's striking, really, how we think at our social networks now something weird, bizarre, with the followers and people but really this has always existed in history. It's always been like that, and the church naturally favored the individuals who had a great charisma and could, especially in such moments where the heresy was spreading, when there were enemies to counter, even from a dialectical point of view, especially in Paris. You have to think there was a very developed rhetorical skill being developed at the time, because there were many debates, many theological debates, and almost all of them were pretty much heterodox, or at least borderline by certain standards, because objectively, from a Christian point of view, you can't have different many different opinions about one thing. One thing is either that way or not, and these guys were debating it, so that you can argue what was being told in Paris was at the time also a way to settle certain theological matters that were unresolved at the time. Even the relation here, think about the dispute of the universals, think about, and why, and that's why, because the the Western Europeans were starting to think about certain aspects, also about science, about natural philosophy, that up to that point had not been fully investigated, or at least that had not brought to a conclusion. And this is not just about a matter of integrating this knowledge into the Christian system, but it was sometimes a matter of naturally debating the Christian system in itself. I mean, there were lots of things that were said by St. Paul or St. Augustine that objectively were interpretable. I mean, the Reformation happened because of this, and because there were certain topics that had been told in classical times. Eventually, nobody had the interest or the possibility to go deeper into that, and it's only when Europe begins to be a bit more intellectual dynamic that these problems came back, because ultimately they were all the same. So what I was thinking, especially from a psychological point of view, is that if you came from a relatively humble environment, you went into these studia of Europe, and Paris was the like the biggest one, especially for a clergyman. Well, you would meet such fascinating figures like Amalric could be, as extremely cultured, intelligent, and thought-provoking people, and you would kind of fall in love with these masters because they were telling you things that were all one essentially with obviously with your own religion, and therefore something you already felt as very, very deeply, very strongly. And if you were especially an intelligent person and you heard this, you would fall in love of the intellectualism in itself, and of all the, and especially in a world where these concepts, these new ideas, were not seen as mere theoretical knowledge, but that they could really have a real effect on your life, and even on matters like salvation, for instance. So even the perspective of saving your soul by understanding what this master was saying. So thinking, we will see how exoteric relatively these were mostly Gnostic thinking, Gnostic thoughts, sorry. They had this idea that there was certain stages of revelation, and this is why the whole thing was so controversial, because naturally Gnosticism is something that is incompatible with the Christian belief, for which it's mostly a very direct, very simple thing. After all, the whole thing, as you truly believe, you don't need further stages of knowledge that only certain people can go through. But these thoughts had arguably remained alive since everywhere. So it wasn't, even Gnosticism in here doesn't have to be understood as a rational process, still a rational one, but it had to be somehow guided by a master. So this is why to obtain salvation. So this is why such figures were so influential and so charismatic, so fascinating, so for their pupils even to die for them, apparently, as it happened with Amalric's followers. The other followers were, however, because, by the way, this movement had spread also within other people. So the clergymen were more deeply, influenced by Amalric's thoughts. Were, as we've seen, most of them were killed. Only one retracted in the end. The other followers, the other people, were instead forgiven by the church because they were believed to have been, as laymen, to be ingenuous. So this is also interesting because the attitude of the church was at this point very elitistic in some way. If you think about it, if the layman has such heterodox thinking, well, okay, let's forgive him because it's just an ignorant, he's naive, he doesn't understand. As long as he accepts, obviously, the accepts orthodoxy, but it's not a big deal. Here, the church was extremely concerned, evidently, about especially what would happen into the clergy in itself, and it's obvious because if you have this heterodoxy spreading within the same church, well, that can become an extremely serious business, given that the church is so at this time so structured, so well built. So we're talking about the acme of under Innocent the third at this time of the secular temporal power of the church. So even if a branch of the church had gone astray, that would have been a pretty serious problem. And these were, by the way, the same years of the Albigensian crusade as well. So in that case, at least, the Albigensians had been pictured as this, as if there was a whole part of France that was going astray, not just as a, in all branches of society, including the church. And also in there, probably the popes were trying to stress the heretical nature of their rivals, whereas probably most of them weren't neither so heterodox as we would think. So who were the cadres? This is also a video I made on how sometimes these heretics were depicted more as such from the church that actually by it is natural, because you need a justification to condemn these people. So if you don't like what they're saying, if you're concerned, you have to repress them some way, and you have to be very very straightforward in this. You have to be also to use a very strong deterrent power to ensure that this doesn't happen anymore. I realize that it can be heinous for me to take the side of people who wanted to kill other people in the names of such ideas, and I realize that this has huge implications in our world, etc. But when I discuss these topics, by the way, quite poorly, like today, because I realize that this video kind of sucks now at this point. But what I really want is to offer the perspective of everybody, and especially in that specific context, because you don't have to think that these were free thinkers that were put on the corner and condemned as if they would have never done something like that on their rivals, because at that time that was the normal business of how things had to happen. It was the normal way, and they also were quite repressive, as I was saying. That they were not tolerant as we imagined them. These were being an heretic. You don't have to think of the heretic in this sense as an heretic, but you don't have to think it even as a hero in the country, because the normal thing here is saying, okay, well, these were poor people, free thinkers that they were accused of heresy. It was not true. Well, how evil was the church in the Middle Ages, and blah blah blah. This is not truly how it happened. These people felt themselves to be equally part of the church in the same way. The church at the time was extremely powerful at every and extremely influent at every level of society. There were huge interests. These were extremely serious matters. It is sure, of course, we have sympathy for the intellectual independence of these people. They're willing to assert their, to affirm their beliefs, and because they truly believe in them, so we estimate them. But at the same time, they were still pretty strange people for our moral standards, and quite debatable, quite controversial. Even if you go, I don't know, 100 years ago, and you think about, I don't know, let's not just talk about clergymen, but everyone that was Christian and that was, I don't know, famous for some positive reason. And I don't know, was maybe a scientist that invented something or did something good for society or for politics and all, then maybe you're gonna dig a little bit in his or own past, his or own beliefs, and you maybe discover that this person held very disturbing beliefs about certain things you had not thought of. This is normal. So just think about how a clergyman of the early 13th century really could be, compared to our way of thinking. We would. It's very difficult even to have the level of education that these people had really to understand how they could think, because also the way they studied, it's not a way it exists anymore. So even the inner approach towards religion, towards these new ideas, it's something that by a certain extent, for instance, we will never know. We will never get to know, unfortunately, but it is a sad truth. But secondly, it was probably also in there dictated by many factors, also in here, that have not perhaps everything to do with religion. At least this is my opinion, and I don't think so. And this doesn't mean to diminish really the nature, I mean how these people believed, because surely these people believed. You don't go at the stake when you have the opportunity to retract if you don't really truly believe. So at the same time you have to respect these people, at the same time you can still argue that were pretty weird people in the first place, and not because they were heretics, but because they were people of those times. So for us, subjectively, they would seem strange, they would seem controversial, and this is how really I think the approach towards these topics should be, because otherwise, if people keep judging history through their own moral standards, you can surely do some good, because indeed bad things, I'm not a moral relativist myself, so bad things are bad things, point. But at the same time, if you stress too much that key of interpretation, you end up to focus only on the moral problem and not on the strictly historical one. That is, let's try to figure out how these people were, because the major problem, historically speaking, for us today is really to, especially for these topics, taking into consideration thinking, doctrines, and intellectual work, is really the fact that we lack evidence to understand up to which point these people, what these people really thought and believed. And it takes a huge, really a huge work to try to even get the smaller detail from paleography, from philology, from history, to really say, okay, let's try to understand what the moral sensitivity of this person was, what his beliefs really were. Sorry, I digress, but I realize sometimes I say controversial things myself, and I'm putting them out here, and I wonder what people who listen to me really think about how I deliver them, because I'm not making a point based on my subjective opinion here. I mean, yeah, of course, the opinions, everything is subjective, but what I'm trying to say, I'm not bringing my sympathies into the way I speak. I talk about history in my very modest, in the very modest way I do. But I feel the need to explain certain things, at least from a methodological point of view, because otherwise you'll think I have an agenda. And telling the truth, the situation is extremely remotely like that. It's not even remotely like that. Therefore, I'm not here to make a pro whatever, or I'm not really making a point for myself or to impose you the way I see it. I'm just saying, just be aware that the people of that time were extremely different from us, and that it's even very difficult to draw a line between what kind of an heterodox or orthodox thinking was at the time. Because at the time also this was left in an approximate way, because obviously at the time there was a strong opinion about what was orthodox or was not, but that also depended from the person who believed that. And into this, it's not just an intellectual matter, it's a matter of saying, okay, but what were the interests, what were the beliefs, why did these people believe like that? And all these different diverse experiences, etc., some of them were integrated into the church, some of them were repressed instead, and sometimes for reasons that were not strictly religious. So this has always to be taken into consideration. Having said this, so the laymen were forgiven. The women, there were also, this is also fascinating, there were lots of women that followed Amalric's thought. Like, there were lots of women into the pauperistic evangelical movements. Many of the heterodox thinking was also related to the prerogatives of the Christian woman and what she couldn't do. And also here we might maybe say, okay, yeah, this maybe certain movements gave more importance to women. But if you say, oh wow, they had been so cool. Well, it wasn't really like that, because still women were mistreated and conceived, also religiously speaking, in certain fashion that today is kind of debatable, even for Christian standards. So we never have to, because that's relativism. If you don't understand this, you're just taking a stand because that person leans towards a direction that you like more, but you kind of lack the perspective that still that belief was kind of weird. Weird is a bad term. Is kind of disturbing. Let's put it in this way for our moral standards. And the women were considered to have simply were forgiven as well, because they were believed to have been deceived or misled by Amalric's thoughts. So also in here, double standards for men and women, as women were considered to be more gullible, or at least that they had a less to be more easily influenced. Also, given most of them were used to only believe their men, so also in here men had a greater responsibility compared to women. And by the way, women couldn't really it's not that they couldn't really teach, because this is also perhaps a little myth that, of course, women didn't teach extensively at the time. There were surely women at this time that were extremely highly educated, and sometimes they taught to someone else. But generally speaking, the man also owned a responsibility for, especially his wife, his daughters, etc., also in the way he thought. So that responsibility was taken as more seriously, and this was not just a religious matter, it was also actually a juridical matter, because the men had certain rights over their women. So consequently, the men's choices were to affect even the women of their family. So if you look at the group of the clergymen were put under trial and eventually condemned, except for one. These were very educated people, as we were saying. They were especially experts in dialectic, in theology, and some of them had managed to obtain the grade of magister, that is master, and so they were teachers as well. And this was why. This is the reason why the whole thing had been so freaking serious, because these people were teaching to other people, and the heresy could spread that easily and that fast, and having sort of exponential growth. So these clergymen would what they had really felt the need to spread their ideas, and the what they started doing was to basically go beyond the mere intellectual activity, beyond the mere intellectual exercise. Because, by the way, knowledge was at this time very mechanical. Just think about these people were studying logic, as we were seeing. Logic was, in fact, being developed in this extremely logical way. It was a chain of beliefs, of ideas that were all brought together by very logical standards. So they sometimes certain heresies were quite dialectically built. I mean, it was the idea that also in here, what was the value of the word as such, of the words? The dispute of the universals is a very clear evidence of this. So the language was considered naturally, especially in our religion of the book, as to be a matter of not just a linguistical expression, of communication, but also of deliver of actual contents, of actual truth. And the great speculation had always been arguably about finding out that truth. This is not something that humans have always tried to create a sort of universal language. Universal system of communication can be valid because it is true for everybody, and naturally we have given it up unless you don't think about mathematics. And this happened also outside the Christian experience. At this time it was being done there. These clergymen had, however, how we were saying, gone past beyond that. They transformed their ideas into a religion that was working within mankind. So these ideas were very influenced by pantheism, Gnosis, a lot of attention to St. Paul's theology, and also eschatological optimism. It was believed that indeed these all things were blended together, and we can spot in here a great influence of the Gioachimists into within the Amalricians. Now, what are these really thoughts about? Well, pantheism, emanatism are concepts that are, I think, pretty unknown. Pantheism is the idea that the universe is somehow a big whole, and that there is a sort of intrinsic divine nature into everything. And this same goes in part for Emanatism. You have to think at the school of Chartres, where Amalric had also excuse me, sorry, I've got a bit of a... And he had been influenced by, as we've said, by John Scotus Eriugena and the masters of Chartres that had a very strong Platonic, or better, Neoplatonic influence. And Neoplatonism is arguably a lot about pantheism, and especially Emanatism as a way, as a descriptive model of the universe. So Emanatism is the idea that the world is essentially created by an emanation from a greater source of there was a big deal of also of contrast between this source. It was pure spirit in some way, and the outskirts of itself from a pantheistic point of view that instead was less perfect. This is how the Neoplatonic had Neoplatonism had explained things like evil in nature, etc., because it was an imperfection coming from a broader model that in its outskirts was kind of less intense and therefore presented these anomalies as such. So these theories also took into consideration a very strong, like with Catarism or Bogomilism and similar movements, and the sharp contrast between spirit and matter, because matter was considered an anomaly in practice, and spirit was instead considered as a divine thing that had to elevate itself to basically come back to where it belonged. And this is Platonism purely, because this is also the idea that the soul basically is attracted by God because it's akin to it, and this is, by the way, what before Aristotle, the in Western Europe there had been a mostly Neoplatonic influence in their thinkings. This came from St. Augustine, but also from works like the one of Dionysius that had been translated, or better, the pseudo Dionysius that had been studied, and even Aristotle, when it came into the West, was actually highly influenced by Platonism itself. There had been many syncrasies also in the Arab world between these two systems. So this was arguably a way to... It was even more, because Platonism had kind of been accepted partially by Western Christianity as something traditional, a little bit, that was observed in fact in works of these like St. Augustine and the pseudo Dionysius. Aristotle was something completely new, although here it was Platonism, by especially Amalric's thought, was still prevailing, but also influenced a lot, and was in fact a lot of Platonism in the same Aristotle commentaries at this point. The St. Paul's theology also posed other problems that were would be considered in continuity with the ones posed by St. Augustine. The doctrine of salvation, of grace, they were all conceived in the whole thing, because this new ideas were stressing in fact, the eschatological optimism. I mean, the idea that mankind was, however, to renew itself while preparing for the second come of Christ. The coming of Christ, and these were ideas that, as we've seen, also were very strongly tied to Gioachimism, which had was this movement. It was a millenarian. The Joachites were a millenarian group essentially, and basing their ideas on the works of Joachim from Fiore, that also had died. He had lived in the 12th century, but actually died also in 1202, or seemingly so. These were figures that were relatively new in the say intellectual landscape of Western Europe, and that had launched these new ideas of, that the end was near, that there were prophecies that the world had to end for Joachim in 1260, and the idea was that the world was passing through several ages. The first one was the age of the Father, which had been the one of the Old Covenant. Then the second age was one of the Son, that had begun with the naturally with with Jesus Christ, and the third and final age would be the one of the Holy Spirit. So this one would arrive practically to with a coming of the end, towards the ends of times. So the third age was to be accompanied by a spiritual renewal of Christianity. That had to happen in this age, according to the Joachimites. And the Joachimites had believed that the New Age would be egalitarian and essentially monastic in model. So just think also in here, relatively to the controversial thoughts that we had before, how could you really think that everybody would become, that human society would become monastically oriented at the time? I mean, these were very strong and even extremistic thoughts, if you think about it. So really, even the expectations of these movements were sometimes to be regarded as dangers, because if there was also social order at the time, and you can't really make it wholly collapse, and obviously this was utopistic at a point that it was unfeasible, but at the same time it could bring to social disorder, considering all the problems that these movements caused, also in strictly social and economical terms, because sometimes these people were huge crowds. Some of them were also armed. They could really become dangerous also for the sake of public order. This wasn't the case of the Amalricians, but I mean the thing is, what is the world coming to? From the Orthodox side, they were saying, why are these people so overconfident about themselves? Why do they think that these prophecies are true? How can you think they truly believe in their preachers? And these are legitimate. This is legitimate criticism. It's obvious that there was a lot of interest behind these things, because these movements were challenging essentially the primacy of of the Church of Rome, the not the primacy, how you call it, at least the first place, the Church of Rome, of its organization. And it was evident that the Church of Rome was corrupt, but everybody was corrupt at the time. I mean, any kind of institution at the time was corrupt, so it was kind of shooting on the red cross a little bit. It's not a very difficult thing to do. The point is, okay, but look what else is being done. In terms of ecclesiastical administration, and yeah, of course, there were great interests also in here, but the Church of Rome was still presenting a model of order in a world that otherwise how it could have been. There are so many extremes in the societies that always happen in the same way. I mean, it doesn't take to believe in such things to find in all times in history this kind of extremism. Let's be frank about it. This has nothing to do with Christianism. I mean, Christianism is arguably a very radical and extremistic thinking if you think about it, because the lifestyle, the model presented by Christ is, it's extraordinary, I believe. And this is the point. It's extraordinary, and it's even meant to be metaphorical in certain ways, because actually God knows that mankind is always it's always going to sin, and that a perfect society on earth cannot exist. The justice does not belong to this world. This is the first assumption. So, however, this is the point, that Christianity has also many other... it can be interpreted. Christianity, I think, in itself gives a lot of room for reflection, thinking, broader. These thinkers now in Paris were kind of trying to integrate Christianity mostly with certain physical or metaphysical models coming from other sides. And probably they were also overconfident about their, the scientific side of the whole thing, because they were extremely fascinated by the idea that there was somehow a way to reach salvation that naturally wasn't rationally believed, but because it had to come essentially from a different direction. It had to be something a mysterious, exoteric knowledge. This is the deal with the Gnosis and why it is so controversial, because it's knowledge, but it's not a conquest of truth starting from experience, for instance, or by certain postulated principles. This is also what made these doctrines subtle, because we've seen how these guys studied logic, for instance, but Gnosticism has nothing to do with a logical. This knowledge cannot be achieved through a logical work, or by demonstrating this rationally. The Gnosis is something. It's a knowledge derived, revealed by divine mysteries, and from this essentially ineffable greatness of God. So also in here the role of the master was quite controversial, because I always thought, and I don't know how true this is, it's how were these people really Gnostic? Because Gnosticism can bring also to a sort of moral justification, like saying, okay, we know that this is the truth, this is the way. There is all this kind of symbolism. For instance, the Gnosis usually comes in form of myth, of even of images, of it's as if the truth reveal itself in the through certain symbols that are hidden in the world. But yet these symbols have not to be are not something everybody can understand. This is the main problem with Gnosis, that is very different from, and that's why it's a heresy. It's a heresy from a Christian perspective, because everybody, Christianly speaking, can recognize Jesus Christ as He's our Lord and Savior. Gnosis is telling you, and it takes relatively a few. I mean, it takes something so great like grace to be given by God, and to be now discussing about grace is extremely difficult, but it takes a pure heart essentially and a true faith to be saved. Gnosticism tells you that not only this happens for a few people de facto that are somehow privileged, and this is an idea that you find also in other Christian actually interpretations. Think about Protestantism actually stresses the extreme difficulty of being saved in practice. At least there is always someone who is not going to be saved. In the Gnosticism, however, is telling you that there are this kind of small group of elected people who were initiated, and therefore they are ready to receive this knowledge. So what I personally have never properly understand about Gnosticism is, if this knowledge doesn't happen through this initiation that is supposedly, however, carried out through certain rites, certain rituals, how can you actually access to it? I mean, there is always a degree of rationality, of knowledge meant as properly experienced and postulated by certain principles that you have to go through in order to get that knowledge, the ultimate knowledge. So, and this is evident because it's something that goes by stages. It's very exoteric. It's initiatic. It's something, and even Christianity in itself, it's like that, because you participate to the mysteries. You go through rituals that are, and so my personal belief is that these people, in the case of the Amalricians, were, as others, by the way, who had this great knowledge and beliefs, were somehow very self-confident. I mean, about their intellectual skills, about their culture, and they thought themselves to be more elevated because of that. So it wasn't just about being humble, in my opinion. It was really saying, okay, I know these things because I've read them on certain books. By the way, are not even, in this case, properly, they're not the Holy Scriptures. Obviously, these people perfectly knew the Holy Scriptures, but they were being inspired by other texts, other knowledge, other things that had also partially nothing to do with Christianity, if not at all. So I would like to learn more about this to tell you how is intellectualism really influencing these attitudes, because to me it really is. I mean, it's something very seductive from a enticing from a psychological point of view. I mean, the idea you follow someone who owns the truth. Something, especially if you are a young student, if you are so thirsty of knowledge, you want to know, you're concerned about your salvation, you're concerned about your journey in the world, thinking how those times were, etc. You feel this anxiety, this tension for reaching the ultimate salvation, and you need to feel that psychologically that there is a comfort, that there is a way you can do that, a passage. And it's too bad we don't really know what Amalric was preaching, because otherwise it would be extremely and most important. And this was expressed, by the way, by the belief that they were living into the beginning of this new era, the era of the Spirit, as we've seen. And it was the last one, and that had to be essentially the prelude for the end of times, where they had necessarily to act in a different way. And this, in my opinion, couldn't really happen if not thanks to the development of the world. I mean, there was an optimism that you can see in this, because why did this anxiety about the end of the world? Surely it was a very violent time, it was a very violent moment to live, but that's not the point, because it had always been like that. At this time, however, there was the chance to get to know the world. There was a chance to read, there was a chance to travel. Europe was rising, as we were saying, it was becoming always wealthier, so there were more people who could kind of wake up by just learning and say, okay, this world is terrifying, but it's also fantastic, it has so many options. So this satisfaction deriving from learning, from acquiring knowledge, it was somehow reflected on the background of the Christian view of the world, we can say. The idea that somehow what's going to happen at the end of times is going to be remunerative for people. So even the view of afterlife was changing in these years. It was being believed that it was easier to be saved. So this is also positive. I mean, not easier to be saved, it was felt like that. But it's a very subtle thinking, because it's easier, and if you have a way to do it. So that's why these beliefs were so popular. I mean, not really popular in this case, because this was an elitist context, as we have seen, but why it was believed that such perfection could really be achieved, because really also this exaltation for the end of times, this expectation the world would end soon, was something that people were waiting for in a certain measure, with fear but also with a greater confidence now. And it was also a way to gain power, in my opinion, because if you tell people that you have a way to get yourself saved, obviously you're gonna be followed, you're gonna be heard, you're gonna be listened, at least. And this is a way even to make feel yourself that what you're thinking is right. So really many different beliefs, many different approaches, a very psychological, complex psychological way of looking at these movements. I'm sorry today that I don't express myself so well, but I'm trying to really figure out how it could be from an intellectual point of view, because that's what I'm mostly fascinated by. Because with the rest of the evangelic paparistic movements, I really want to stress the material dimension of why these movements happen. From an intellectual point of view, it's more subtle, and it's also more fascinating. So this is the point. From the to the age characterized by the sacramental forms of the church was about to follow the age of the spiritual knowledge. This is the key. The idea was very subversive in part, because it was saying, okay, up to now the church has behaved in a certain way, we're gonna go past that. The church will be not this hierarchical thing that we see today, this structure. It's gonna be really the people. It's gonna really be the Spirit and the believers, and the believers will live free, essentially, in a purely spiritual way, in a way that is based on reason. And there is a lot of anthropological, of confidence in humanity in these thoughts, if you think about it, because these are, from one side, there is always someone who was gonna be punished, who's got it wrong in a certain way and will pay for this, and probably naturally also these people were scared, but they were convinced that still the best way was to extend this to the world Christianity, also for a matter of moral duty, because you know that this is kind of going to happen. The end of the world is gonna arrive soon, and you don't really know what you should tell. You should spread the word. It was a way, in this sense, also as a model to feel closer to God, perhaps, in this mission of also partly revealing. So there was a divine understanding to this, and so this was happening, by the way, through another very worrying way from a strictly orthodox point of view. That is essentially the fact that the sacraments, the Eucharist, and also the certain cultural forms and the saints and the usual moral norms were essentially to be devalued. It was felt, this is antinomism, essentially. It's the idea that that you're gonna somehow refuse this collective regulations, and leave a fully spiritual experience. In English I think it's antinomianism, really, not antinomism. Basically means against the law. It's any view that rejects, for instance, laws and legalism. And it goes even the same moral, religious, and social norms. And this is, I think, the most worrying side of the story. It's the idea that there was a world that was coming apart, and what was the alternative, really? Because this is really the truth. What is that? Even the criticism towards this is, I don't know how to say that, because sometimes I'm very squared and I think that society has to be regulated. I firmly believe that society has to be regulated, that there's always been a loss of freedom, of rights of some sort in everything, because you can't live in a society where everything works perfectly. This obviously doesn't legitimate any form of, you should fight for something, but sometimes you for those rights, for that freedom, but there can't be complete freedom, otherwise there's not going to be a society, and this is a condemnation, if you want. But what's the alternative? And take this situation in the beginning of the 13th century, that by the way, the church was already successfully stemming the heresies. At least it had now finally all the moral and material means to make it. Many people say, well, but the church at this point kind of stemmed all these movements. It kind of stemmed other views, other perceptions, other approaches to religion, to the way of you feel, you believe. But at the same time, if you look at these alternatives, what they were really about? Because every single one of them I'm reading about was criticizing bitterly the social order. And you can't understand that. I mean, it's not something... it's controversial, but it's not... just imagine to live in a society like the medieval one. It was a terrible world. Let's be honest about it. It was corrupted, it was violent. Justice was, usually, as most of the times in history, was just about, how rich you were, in which connections you had, basically. There was some justice, naturally, but it also depended very much, on who was involved in the situation. So, plus, you were Christian, so you were taught, since you were little, lots of things that were really permeating your whole life. I think it was also a very different type of living Christianism compared to today. Because today we have, for instance, different ways of learning, different ways of looking at the world. At the time, Christianism was something that had a much higher specific weight for an individual's thinking. The whole life was about that. So you had, from this side, this extreme unjust society, from the other that you suffered of. From the other side you had instead the examples provided by the Bible, especially by the New Testament, is essentially in a radically opposed way. So it was normal to say, okay, this world is messed up. We have to come back to the truth of the Bible. We have to really go past these things. But what was the practical alternative? This was the main problem. How could you... This is the point. How could you really enforce such view of society, if not making it collapse? And we know that human societies do not collapse like that, because there are extremely inescapable socio-economical dynamics that prevent society to collapse, unless there is not a very destructive force that comes from the outside. Nobody's gonna make collapse a civilization like it was the one of 13th century Europe, just because you wanted to follow a monastic, Christ-like lifestyle. How could you make society function? So, in my opinion, my very personal opinion in here, just throwing out, is that most of these people probably had other interests in this, and many others were considered, in fact, to be incapable of thinking it. It's pretty obvious that that society would have, even if it had managed to be kind of destroyed, would have still rebuilt itself on certain different bases. Let's look at medieval Europe as a whole. Yeah, it was Christian, but did it really prevent people from behaving in non-Christian ways? Of course not. Christianism is utopistic. It's not even meant, this is the point, it's not even meant to work in reality. It just provides a model to make you feel within ethically challenged to make the world going better. But in the whole anthropological conception of Christianity itself, you're a sinner, point. So your society is always gonna suck. You're always gonna suffer. You're always gonna have crime. You're gonna always have, and this is not a justification for it. But at the same time, it's a way of saying, let's appreciate what we managed to do to better society bit by bit, and this can happen usually only if you have an organization that works. Otherwise, it's pure idealism, and in fact, even if you look at the same monastic ideals, what you see is that the very first Christian monastic ideals were extremely radical, extremely, also in here, obviously a geography kind of idealized the whole thing, but the hermetic models were something incompatible with society as we mean it as the civilization that already existed at that time. It was meant to operate together with, not together with, but to be looked by from society, because the monastic experience was not something completely undetached from the world at all, because the monastic example had to be an example, in fact, so it had to be observed, but theoretically to transform that society into a fully monastic world. But if you see how eventually the same monasticism evolved, it couldn't happen in a different way. It became structured, it became something, abbeys and monasteries became essentially lordships on their own. They were aristocracies in practice, and they administrated lands, they had armies, they fought wars, they did a lot of these things. And the Middle Ages is prime example of this. Why did this happen? Because the rule went astray? Well, probably, but even if you look at, for instance, the rule of Saint Benedict, and even if there is a lot of criticism whether, philological, when it was written by whom, there are people who today deny even the same figure of Saint Benedict himself. But if you stick to that, however, how it came to us from the 6th century, you see that there is always I love Saint Benedict's rule. It's I think it's very intelligent in this sense, because it shows you that you can't do without your human material dimension. You have to survive in that world. You have to live, you have to work the land, for instance, to eat, because otherwise you can't survive. And it's a sin in practice to let yourself die. So even this terrible deprivation that the original monasticism was really about is something, in my opinion, very, very debatable at best. And it's only when you try to make the Christian values work with an organized society that you have civilization. Because the mankind is not meant to refuse its own nature. It's kind of caged in its own nature, but by the original sin. But it's not meant to passively accept this, like, okay, now I'm a sinner, so society has to be a disaster, or I just want to get out of here because I don't like it, and just pretend that basically society commits sort of collective suicide by just going back to a lifestyle that ultimately doesn't pertain to us. The Bible kind of appreciates also civilization part. of course, the New Testament is much more idealistic. It's much more spiritual, in fact. It's the it's a sort of overtaking, sort of surpassing of the law, of the Old Testament law, but still has certain a model that, well, it's difficult to really express now, but just for saying that I tend to lean for from the side of the Roman Church during this time of the Middle Ages, and not really saying, okay, well, everything they did was fine at all. Certain things were horrible, and it doesn't even make sense to say, okay, I side with that, but I kind of understand it more. You know, if you asked me what was the better model compared to those ones that were being promoted, I'd say I stick to the Roman Church, because these other models were not objectively, you know, what is society meant to be, really throwing everything we have created with so much difficulty, with so much progress, with the tears and sweat and blood of millions, for saying, okay, I get rid of all of that because I have to show it's not important. We have done good with progress, with science, so why should we take that away? And that's why I don't I make this terrible confession. I don't like very much these evangelic papistical movements, because to me they were too undetached from reality. There was a certain fanatism that goes beyond even it doesn't build. It's just saying everything is gonna collapse now. The end of the world is near, so we just better, get rid of everything, so that we can get this innocence that it's as if they could say, okay, we know how to get saved. In Christian ways, how can you conceive I know how to get saved? It should be something so inner, so personal, so related to your faith and nothing else. Because you can help the others through material objects, even through things that have not strictly to do with religion. And this is perfectly adaptable also in a lay perspective. The world, we all have a moral duty to make this world better, which doesn't mean to necessarily help the others, like giving everything to them, or I'm not looking at that either. I'm just looking, if we all work by ourselves, we can really help the society as a whole. This is my point. These movements were going against another direction. We're not debating how, I've been too harsh indeed, because even the evangelical papistical movements had some instances that were definitely positive. For instance, there was a greater engagement of women in these movements. There was a greater need for kind of a general spread of the word, a greater participation of the whole society to it. So these are positive things, and they were actually what, in fact, the Roman Church adopted and integrated at this time. Think about the mendicant orders. Think about all these other series of orders of where even women could join. So it was fine. It could have a kind of a life that was halfway between monasticism and the mundane world. It was fine, really. There were other problems, including naturally the thing from the Roman Church, that if you said something that was not what they wanted, they would kill you. Okay, but as we've said, this mostly happened when you were essentially shouting it out loud, and especially influencing certain circles that were they could spread this unorthodox thing or debatable thinking somewhere else, and especially by backing it with works that at the time were not part, obviously, of Christianity. So what does the Church do? The Roman Church is able to integrate Aristotle in its own view of the world. It's not few, it's a great work of civilization. So even the Roman Church in here was not just a repressive system, organization. It was something that worked, made civilization to integrate, to try to adapt what was feasible, was good. And if you think about the same Gregorian reforms, obviously there were huge political interests. It was mostly a political way, let's be honest about this. But it was still coming, however, ideally, and it was deeply and really felt from instances of renewal of the Church, of purification of the Church. We said it many times. So it's a matter of looking not at the extremes, but looking really more at the practical consequences. So I'm not saying that the evangelic papacyrical movements were incapable of providing new forms of organization. But knowing human society, those forms of organization would have still grown hierarchical, they would have still grown corrupted, they would have still gone, it would have been like that. So you can argue also in here that not everything had to happen because before I kind of used this fact that it had to be deterministically necessary that the Roman Church presented the best model of organization. But other models were possible, definitely, and they would become possible. Just think about the Reformation. But the broader relation with politics, with society, would remain the same. Corruption, interests, abuse of power, censorship. I mean, it's something that kept existing out there for centuries, and we went past that only when there were other premises that allowed to go past that. So what was the other plausible model that could exist within the Middle Ages? It's difficult to answer. Actually, this is a big historical question. I want to say, there was no other model. You know that I don't like this this deterministic way of thinking. But at the same time, I think the Roman Church was able to work for some order that allowed other things to expand. And it's difficult also in here to see how much that order could remain present if, for instance, other massive structural changes of society didn't occur, because you realize that these heresies actually remained out there for a very long time. Actually, to be honest, they were never eradicated completely. This is also another thing. I mean, there's always been a part of society that is gonna follow them. That recently I made a video about 14th century heresies, the repression of the apostolics, for instance, Segarellus and Dulcinus. Well, that is a brilliant example of how even there these movements were still alive, how they partially collapsed with the end of in the middle 14th century because of the general collapse and sclerotization of let's say crystallization of European society in terms of social certification. But those movements also show you how they had no real cohesion after all. I mean, their cohesion was low, and the only way they made it to stick together was to take arms and to enter into the connection with political powers. So entering into a game that was essentially the same one they were criticizing, with war and bloodshed and all. And ultimately disappointing their own followers, because they I don't know, they were claiming that the end of the world was near, and obviously the end of the world didn't arrive. So in the case of Dulcinus, he had to say, okay, well, it didn't happen, but it will happen soon. So even betraying the trust of people who actually believed in that, generally were afraid of the end of the world and were expecting it with a certain moral tension, I'm sure, as good Christians are really in many ways. So what did that model bring to, if not to bloodshed? This is my question, and that's why I don't know. Maybe I'm not looking at the other way. I'm not looking at the the inequality, the oppression, the kind of control of the ecclesiastical elites that they had on society, but also in there it was probably much more fluid than it seems, and this oppression, inequality, and violence and all was present at the time at all levels of society, every single where in the world. So also in here, yeah, it's not we have to accept them, we have to back it, but kind of makes sense. It lets you reflect in part. So you understand that even devaluating things like the sacrament and the Eucharist, it can't be accepted or from an Orthodox point of view. And then you wonder why these people were burnt at the stake. Well, okay, we're talking about the 13th century. You go out there saying the sacraments are useless, or the Eucharist, not so much. What do you expect is going to happen? They knew what they were going, and they kind of accepted their own fate. So they were consistent with themselves to get killed for these ideas. So this is also something shouldn't be forgotten, and that really impresses, I think, anyone who reads this story, because you might say, well, these people got themselves killed because of these ideas. So what did really push them to do so? Was probably a true, genuine concern, and yeah, it's very. Another crucial idea of the Amalrician movement is that the men of the third age. So these are, as we said before, always Gioachimists' beliefs, is that the man of the third age, by knowing the true knowledge, was basically God incarnated. This is also very very powerful stand, to say essentially there is no difference between me and God, as from a spiritual point of view we are the same. This is a very challenging belief. So the Amalricians opened a quite heterodox current that definitely was to be actually qualified eventually as the heresy of the free spirit afterwards. This was a movement that was to flourish, especially, telling the truth, in Northern Europe between the 13th and 14th century. So these were antinomianists, they were individualists, and they were officially declared heretics in at the Council of Vienne in 1312, and this is often associated to the Amalricians, in fact, and they were called brothers and sisters of the free spirit as well. And these people believed to have no sin. That is better, that they didn't sin by performing actions were usually believed to be sinful, because they were invested by the Holy Spirit. And it's interesting because these were things from Guglielma the Bohemian. She was also influenced by this thought. So the presence of women is very important, and Saint Clare from Montefalco actually was she denounced this heresy herself, and she actually condemns very harshly the adepts of this sect, and she actually wrote even in many of his instrucciones. She confuted the theories of the free spirit movement, and we will talk about that someday. And but it's important to remember it was extremely widespread as a belief, as something that evidently was perceived as a need at the time in some way, and it owns this kind of very antinomianist attitude, for which, okay, we can do whatever we like. It can be also interpreted as a moral rebellion, not just to Christianism, because we often think the Christianism here was the determining factor. Not necessarily. Even if you take Christianism out of the equation, you realize that society at the time worked in a certain way, with a certain moral, with certain beliefs that were not substantially just Christian, were beliefs that existed ever since a freaking long time. Even think like being prudent, having a certain moral conduct, it was something that existed in all society, even previously than Christianism. Naturally, it was normal. Just like today, there are still lots of Christians, but they have different morals, let's say, sort of different customs from naturally the ones of the past. It's normal, and you can argue that great part of the greatness of a certain thought, of a certain belief, stands also in the ability of adapting to the new times. So, as you see, what I would like to leave you with is making you reflect on how many different causes were present beyond these movements. Today, with the Amalricians, I wanted to stress mostly the intellectualism. That definitely was the most important thing, and you can't avoid to do that by talking the 13th century school of theology in Paris, because that was such an effervescent world, and it would lead the whole Western thought would be strongly influenced by what was happening in there. However, there are many complex factors, really many complex factors, and it's even difficult to draw a line, because today, for instance, we discuss this as if we were talking about a specific group of people, but as we have seen, there were many other followers that even of Amalric that the church kind of forgave, for they were not believed to be so excessively dangerous or subversive, and that kind of lived on. So how can you know what is in a person's mind? And the fact that these ideas lived on makes you think that it was not just about, that school, those clergymen, those scholars, those students. It was also about a greater social need of some sort. And yeah, that's it. And I realize this is being very long. I confess that one of the reasons is I should have got much more thoroughly into philosophical matters, but I didn't have a lot of time to prepare. But I'm mildly satisfied by this, by these reflections I made, because they help me also a little bit to understand what I'm discussing and how can I present it to you. So, and I think it really gets down to that, because we could also have spent time talking about, I don't know, the Timaeus of Plato, the school of Chartres, or about other things, about Gnosticism and the free spirit, but maybe we'll leave them for some other more specific videos. And let's just make this fit in the the normal, together with all those other videos I made on the pauperistic evangelical movements. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope, at least. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my comments, in my further contents. Sorry, I'm very tired. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.